Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Welcome back to another episode of Podcast of the Caribbean. We are still covering the second movie in the Pirates franchise, Dead Man's Chest. If you didn't listen to part one of this film, go back to the last episode and listen to that one first. That was the longest episode I've done yet at 66 minutes. So we'll see how long this one goes. I'm not sure. These movies are very big, very long movies, so we'll see how long it takes me to get through all these. But this is part two of Dead Man's Chest. Last time we left off right after Will reached the island where the Black Pearl has been beached. So we're going to pick up right where we left off, right from there. So Will has reached the island where the Black Pearl is, and the fisherman agrees to take Will to shore. So Will is in the longboat here with one of the crewmen. And the crewman he stops in the middle of the ocean. He doesn't actually go all the way to the island. And Will's like, why'd we stop? The island's right there. And the guy is like, nope, we're not doing that. Of course, he's speaking in French. So Will is like, whatever, I'm just going to jump and swim. So Will prepares to jump. And then the fisherman says, bon voyage, monsieur. And then Will takes a dive into the water. And he then reaches the island's shore, and he is face to face with the Black Pearl one more time. But he's here and he's calling out for crew members. So he calls out, Marty, Cotton, and of course also for Jack. But no one answers. There is no one on the ship, no one on the shore. So Will is a little confused here, and he decides to venture into the jungle. So he goes in, and then he sees Cotton's parrot. So Will sees, a familiar face. And then the parrot says, what? Don't eat me. And then Will's like, I'm not going to eat you. So Will already knows that something is not right. So Will just keeps on going. He keeps on trekking. And he's going to the jungle, and he finds something notable among the branches. It's Gibbs's flask. So he finds it, and he says, Gibbs. And there's a string attached to this flask. So Will, ends up following the string. So he makes his way along this line, and he makes his way over to a tree, and in this tree is the most horrifying thing for me as a kid. While Will is distracted looking at this string, someone pops out of the tree and scares Will. And let me tell you, so I was a kid when this movie came out. Every time that we reached this scene in the movie, I would look away because I always got so scared of that guy popping out of the tree. But now I just don't anymore. But when I was a kid, I was scared of that guy. I was so scared. I would never watch. I would look away every time he was on screen. It was crazy. But after Will gets spooked by that guy, his leg, of course, is then caught in a trap, and he is pulled up and is now hanging from a branch, and a bunch of cannibals pop out of the jungle and are circling Will. So Will is now trapped. He's trying to fight them off. He's like, come on, who wants it? And he's swinging his sword around. And he's like, I can do this all day. But he's flailing around with the sword, and one of the cannibals just shoots a blow dart into his neck, and Will passes out. And he also drops his sword, which I'm sad about because that's the last time we get to see Will with one of his own swords that he made. I also just love how beautiful that sword looks. So I'm really sad that we lose it so early in this movie, and we just don't get to see that sword anymore. But we then get this beautiful shot of the mountains here So if you're wondering where this whole sequence was shot, this was shot on the island of Dominica in the Caribbean, which is a very remote island. I mean, there's people living there, of course, but it's not as developed as other islands in the Caribbean. So when Gore decided to shoot here, they had to lug all their equipment out, and they pretty much booked up, I'm pretty sure, like every single hotel room on the entire island. Because of course there are some people and there's some buildings and cities, but there's not a lot on this island. So they pretty much bought up every hotel room possible, and they had to trek all their equipment up into this jungle on these hills and mountains and stuff, which was a huge feat. They had to literally build roads so they can get their trucks and equipment in. That when there wasn't able for a road to be built, they had to carry their equipment up. It was a long process to get everything up to where they were shooting for the day. And it was a workout. So they had this whole sequence here in one of the behind the scenes, the According to Plan documentary. It's an hour-long documentary. And it goes through all the different locations and places they shot Dead Man's Chest at. And they also, of course, go on Dominica and everything. And one of the crew members says, you know, you don't even need a gym membership. You can just work on a Pirates film and you'll get in shape. But that was very true, because, you know, people said, you know, it isn't a Gore Verbinski movie unless you have to walk a long distance to get to where you want to shoot. And we'll get to that a little later in this sequence when we get to a ravine. That was somewhere they shot that Gore found on the research trip, and that was a long trek to get to that ravine, because they had to go all the way through the jungle, then swim into it. But I think it's a gorgeous location, and I feel like that's one of the best parts of Dead Man's Chest and At World's End, is that they shot on location as much as they could. You know, movies today, if you saw an island like this, you would think, oh, it's just CGI and they shot it in front of a blue screen and a soundstage. But, you know, in Pirates of the Caribbean, this was shot on location. I feel like it gives it so much more charm, because when you look at these shots of these islands, they are real shots. It's not CGI. Maybe some of it's CGI to enhance it a bit, but a lot of it is real, and I feel like the real locations and the real sets, they really expand the world and really just give it so much more believability. And, you know, as much as I love, you know, movies that come out today and they're done on blue screens and sound stages, I just miss when movies would go out and shoot on location. But of course, it's gotten so expensive to do stuff like this that it really doesn't happen as much anymore, unfortunately. So anyway, we go back, and Will is now being carried by the cannibals through their village here. And I forgot to mention that this is the Pelegosto tribe, and this island, the actual island is Dominica, but in universe, it is the island of the Pelegostos. So they've got Will captured here, and they're going all the way through their village, and they bring him to their chief. And we get the big reveal of who is the chief. Well, the chief is, in fact, Jack Sparrow. Which is pretty funny, and I love his makeup here with the 6 eyes, and then he also has the eyes painted on his eyelids, so he has his eyes closed at first, and then he opens them up, and like, oh my, it's fantastic. But the makeup is fantastic. Whole makeup team, hair team, everything is impeccable in these films. But Will sees Jack, and he's still half asleep. He's like, Jack Sparrow, and then he starts laughing. I can honestly say I'm glad to see you. And then Jack gets up and he walks over to Will, and he taps him, and he starts speaking in the Pelegosto language. Kind of, I mean, Jack probably doesn't really know what he's saying. He's kind of just saying a bunch of random words. But Will's like, you know, Jack, it's me, Will Turner. And then Jack's just saying some stuff to these Pelegostos here, And then Will's like, tell him to let me down. And then I love how Jack, he gets close to Will and he says, eunuchy, snip, snip. And then all the Pelegostos like, eunuchy, which I think is pretty funny. But, of course, Jack doesn't free Will here, but Will sees Jack's compass on Jack as he's walking away. And Will says, Jack, the compass, that's all I need. Elizabeth is in danger. We were arrested for helping you. She faces the gallows. And of course, this stops Jack. And he turns around again and goes back over. And he then goes back to the Pelegostos and gives them an order. And I love how he says something in their language and then he ends with savvy. And then he tells them something we don't really know. Because even the captions, they just say speaking in native language. So unfortunately, they could be saying gibberish for all I know. But they start pulling Will away again, and Jack gets close to Will and he says, save me. And as they are taking Will away, Will's like, Jack, what did you tell them? No, what about Elizabeth? Jack! And then we go from the island of the Pelegosto over to Port Royal again. And we are seeing Elizabeth in jail here. And I love how we have this kind of, I guess it's close to what it is. But in the first movie, of course, we had the 3 prisoners in the jail cell trying to get the dog with the keys to come over. But in this movie, we have some pirates in the next jail cell who are trying to get Elizabeth to come over, so a nice little parallel there, of course, to the ride. But Elizabeth's just sitting there. She doesn't give them the time of day. But she's sitting there, and the cell door opens, and then we see Governor Weatherby Swan, and he tells her to come quickly. So I love this part here. So Governor Swan frees Elizabeth, and they're getting out of the prison, and Elizabeth's like, tell me what's happening. And then Governor Swan's like, our name still has some standing. I've arranged passage to England. The captain is a friend of mine. And then Elizabeth says, no, Will is going to find Jack. And then Governor Swan's like, oh, please, we cannot count on William Turner. And then Elizabeth's like, he's a better man than you give him credit for. And then Governor Swan's like, this is no time for innocence. Beckett has offered only one pardon, only one, and that is promised to Jack Sparrow. Even if Will succeeds, do not ask me to endure the sight of my daughter walking to the gallows. Do not. So he ushers her into a carriage, and once she gets in, he says, perhaps I can ensure a fair trial for Will if he returns. And Elizabeth says, a fair trial for Will ends in a hanging. And Governor Swan then says, well, then there is nothing left for you here. And then he closes the door, and he is driving the carriage over to the harbor to meet up with the captain that is going to be taking them back to England. So he tells Elizabeth to stay inside. And he goes over to talk to the captain, who is kind of standing there very still, a little unsettling. But Governor Swan's like, Captain? And then we see the reveal that Ian Mercer has just killed this captain. And it makes me wonder how long Mercer was standing there with the captain. Like, he was just standing there propped up against him for who knows how long, waiting for Governor Swan to show up. But anyway, Mercer unfortunately kills this guy. And this is where everything starts to go wrong. So Mercer says, evening, Governor. Shame, eh? Who's carrying this? And then he pulls up a letter. And then he says, it's a letter to the king. It's from you. And then Governor Swan is super scared, and he begins to run back to the carriage for Elizabeth. And a bunch of East India Trading Company soldiers surround the carriage, and Mercer opens the door, and there's no one inside. So he turns back to Governor Swan, and he says, where is she? And then Governor Swan is like, who? And then Mercer grabs Governor Swan and throws him against the carriage. And then we're thrust into another scene in Beckett's office. I'll say right now, this is also one of my favorite scenes in this entire franchise. I love this scene coming up here. So Beckett is, of course, staying late. I wonder why. But he opens up the box. He notices that something is wrong. He opens it up and he sees the letters of marque are missing. So I love how he knows, like, that Elizabeth is still there. And I spoiled it, but Elizabeth is here in this scene. But I love how he just talks into the open. There's no one around, but he knows that Elizabeth is still there. Because who else would have gotten the letters of marque but Elizabeth? So then we have a fantastic line from Cutler Beckett here, where he says, "No doubt you discovered that loyalty is no longer the currency of the realm as your father believes." And then Elizabeth appears in the background of the shot, and then she says, "Then what is?" And then Beckett responds, "I'm afraid currency is the currency of the realm." Which I love. It's a great line that shows how the world is changing. So, of course, in the first part, he says, loyalty was the currency of the realm. That's, loyalty. We were loyal to people, and that would give you standing, and that would make you rise up. But, of course, then he says, "I'm afraid currency is the currency of the realm," which means that, money is now the driving force behind everyone's actions and their decisions, and just further proves that the world is changing rapidly in these years that these movies are going on in. Then Elizabeth then says, "I expect we can come to some sort of understanding." And then Beckett says, "I'm listening." And then Elizabeth pulls up a pistol and aims at him, and he's like, "I'm listening intently." So Elizabeth holds up the letters of marque, and she's like, "These letters of marque, they are signed by the king, yes." And then Beckett's like, "Yes, and they're not valid until they bear my signature and my seal." Then Elizabeth pulls the pistol down and she says, "Or else I would not still be here." "You sent Will to get you the compass owned by Jack Sparrow. It will do you no good." And then Beckett is intrigued here, and he says, "Do explain." Then Elizabeth says, "I have been to the Isle de Meurthe. I have seen the treasure myself. And there is something you need to know." And then Beckett's like, "Ah, you think the compass leads only to the Isle de Meurthe, and you hope to save me from an evil fate. But you mustn't worry. I care not for cursed Aztec gold. My desires are not so provincial. There's more than one chest of value in these waters." And I love when he says that line, "more than one chest of value in these waters," and you get the chime, the Dead Man's Chest chime in the background. Oh my god, it's fantastic. But I love that part. And this leaves Elizabeth confused. She doesn't show it, but she was in the understanding that Jack's compass led only to the Isle de Meurthe. So now that Beckett has dropped this information on her, that kind of throws an axe or a wrench in her plans. So Beckett then says, "So perhaps you may wish to enhance your offer." And then Elizabeth pulls the pistol and cocks it right under Beckett's chin, and she leads him over to his desk. And then she says, "Consider in your calculations that you robbed me of my wedding night." And then she gives him the letters of marque so he can sign and seal them. And then Beckett's like, "So I did. A marriage interrupted, or fate intervenes." Fantastic line again from Beckett. But then he says, "You're making great efforts to ensure Jack Sparrow's freedom." And then Elizabeth says, "These aren't going to Jack." And then Beckett stops her and is like, "Oh, really? To ensure Mr. Turner's freedom, then? I'll still want that compass. Consider that in your calculations." And Elizabeth grabs the letters back from Beckett, and then she runs out of his office, and she is gone. And I love in this shot, you can see a soldier sitting down on a chair outside. And a lot of people have pointed out, well, why is he just standing there? Why doesn't he see Elizabeth come in or leave? But there's actually a deleted scene where that scene continues and Beckett walks out and he sees that guard sleeping there, and then he kicks him because he's asleep. So unfortunately that was cut out of the movie, but I love that scene with Elizabeth and Beckett. Fantastic dialogue, fantastic story progression in the plot. When you're a kid, you listen to Beckett say all these big words and you're like, I don't know what he's saying. But then when you get older and you understand what he's saying and what he means, and you're like, oh my God, this guy knows what he's talking about. Because Beckett is speaking the truth. Even though he is the villain, he knows what the world wants, and the world is revolving around money and currency. No longer is the world revolving around loyalty and bravery and all these things that it used to be about. It's about money and who has the most money and who can rise to the highest rank the fastest because of how much money they have. So fantastic scene. And then we go back over to another great scene with the return of Pintel and Ragetti. They are back, and they are in a rowboat along the ocean here. And Ragetti has taken up reading the Bible since the curse has been broken. So they have just escaped from jail. They were in jail for pretty much that whole year. So they're in the boat here, and Ragetti's reading the Bible, and then he goes to Pintel and says, I'd say it was divine providence what escaped us from jail. And then Pintel's like, and I'll say it was me being clever. Ain't that right, Poochie? And then we see the prison dog is back, and he's in this boat with Pintel and Ragetti. So if you remember earlier in the movie, when Will and Governor Swan went to see Elizabeth in jail, Governor Swan, he said, and where's that dog with the keys? And he goes to look for him. But he doesn't find the dog because the dog left with Pintel and Ragetti. So I love that little connection there. But Ragetti continues, and he's like, how do you know it wasn't divine providence what inspired you to be clever? Besides, I ain't stealing no ship. So, of course, he's referring to the island that they're approaching, which has, of course, the Black Pearl beach on it, which is the island of the Pelegosto. So Pintel says, it ain't stealing, it's salvaging. Since when did you care? And then Ragetti's like, since we're not immortal no more, we gotta take care of our mortal souls. And then Pintel's like, you can't read. And then I love this line, and Ragetti's like, it's the Bible, you get credit for trying. And then Pintel's like, pretending to read the Bible's a lie. That's a mark against. And he starts pointing his finger up to the sky, of course, meaning God. But they're interrupted by the prison dog barking, and they turn around and they see the Black Pearl on the island. And they're like, look, there it is. So the prison dog jumps out of the boat and begins swimming to shore. So Ragetti's like, what's got into him? And then Pintel's like, must have seen a catfish. And then they start laughing. And out of nowhere, a big wave comes and capsizes their boat. I love the shot of them just in the boat, and they're arguing as the wave comes up, and then they start screaming as the boat capsizes. Oh my God, I love them so much. So they both reach the shore, and Pintel's like, it's ours for the taking. And then Ragetti has had a change of heart, and he's like, tide's coming in, that should help. And then Pintel's confused at Ragetti's change of heart here. But Ragetti's like, well, salvaging is saving, isn't it? And then Pintel's like, there's the truth of it. And they go to get on the ship with the lines that are connected. And they hear some drumming in the distance. And they are kind of creeped out. And Ragetti's like, suppose we better save it as soon as we can, with our souls being in such a vulnerable state and all. And then I love how Pintel tries to do the Father and Son, the Holy Spirit, and he just messes it up like 10 times. And he says, amen to that. So I love that. And they go and climb onto the Black Pearl. And then we go over to back to Jack and the Pelagostos. And they are getting something ready. They're beginning to celebrate a special occasion. So two Pelagostos go and they give Jack a necklace of human toes, which is a little awkward. And now I don't believe these are real toes. There's no way these would be real toes. But Jack Sparrow bites the nail off one of them, and then he spits it out. Pretty funny. But we go right over to Will and the rest of the crew, who are now hanging from these bone cages. And I'm always wondered how they got them in. I mean, they got them in the cages, but how did they really get them on this rope hanging? Because, I mean, it's interesting. If anyone knows how they would have done that, that would be great to know. But they're all sitting here, and we have 2 bone cages. We have all of the important crew members in one bone cage, and then we have all of the non-important crew members in the other bone cage. So you can sense what's going to happen here. So Will, Gibbs, Marty, and Cotton, all the important crew members are in this one bone cage. And, Will is like, why would he do this to us? If Jack is the chief, I... And then Gibbs chimes in, the Pelegostos made Jack their chief, but he only stays chief as long as he acts like a chief. And then Will is like, so he had no choice. He's a captive as much as the rest of us. And then Gibbs says worse, as it turns out. You see, the Pelegostos believe that Jack is a god in human form, and they intend to release him from his fleshy prison. And I love that after Gibbs finishes, Cotton grabs Gibbs' fingers and bites them. Oh my god. I don't know why I find that so funny. But Gibbs is like, they'll roast him and eat him. And then Will's like, where's the rest of the crew? And then Gibbs is like, these cages we're in weren't built till after we got here. So that's a little scary. But Gibbs says the feast is about to begin. Jack's life will end when the drums stop. And then then Will says, well, we can't just sit here and wait, can we? So we go back over to Jack, and they're preparing a fire, and he's like, no, more wood, big fire, I am chief, I want big fire. So they're all distracted, trying to get this fire going, and he distracts as many of the Pelegostos as he can, and then he runs away. So the Pelegostos turn back, and they see that Jack has disappeared. So Jack is trying to make yet another escape. So we get the great Jack Sparrow theme here, playing for, not the first time, I think it's the second time in this movie. Of course, Dead Man's Chest is where we got the iconic Jack Sparrow theme that Hans Zimmer put together. But Jack is trying to escape, and he reaches the edge of a cliff. So he goes over and he looks for something to use, and he sees these big bamboo sticks that he is going to try to vault over like a pole vaulter. But of course, that wouldn't work. So he goes into one of the houses, one of the buildings, and he sees a bunch of cargo that the Pelegostos have raided from maybe ships that have come close or people who have gone onto the island. There's a whole bunch of supplies in here. So Jack grabs a bundle of rope, and then he grabs a can of paprika, and he turns it over and he sees the East India Trading Company logo, and we see Jack grimace when he sees this. So we know that Jack has had experience with the East India Trading Company before. And he steps out of the building, and he comes face to face with a ton of the Pelegostos, and he just says, "Oh, bugger." So he takes this opportunity to kind of make it look like he was just getting supplies for them. So he opens up the can of paprika and he starts putting it on like deodorant. And he's like, "A little seasoning, eh?" And then we cut over to Jack tied up with the rope on the bamboo stick, and then they put him over the fire. So I love how they put him on there, and he's like, "Well done." And then we cut right back over to the crew in the bone cages, and then they are trying to swing the cage to reach the side of the cliff. And I love how when they're doing this, we have that great kind of waltz music playing. Fantastic. I just love this scene where they're trying to reach out and they don't just make it and they fly back the other way and start screaming. But a lot of coordination in this as well, to have everyone try to help swing this cage. And I love how they try to grab it, but the vines pull away and they get sent back one more time. And they come back and they finally grab on to some vines on the cliff. And they start to climb. So Gibbs is like, put your legs through, start to climb. And both cages, of course, are climbing up. And Will's like, come on, men, it'll take all of us to crew the Black Pearl. And then Moses in the other cage is like, actually, you won't need everyone. About 6 would do. And then both cages stop and they look at each other. And then Moses is like, oh dear. And so now we have a contest brewing. So Will's like, hurry! And then they start climbing, and the Moses cage starts climbing, and they're both trying to get up as fast as possible because one bone cage is going to take the Black Pearl for themselves. So I love how Marty is kind of giving them the energy they need, and he's like, come on, is that all you got? But they're climbing up, and then Will sees a Pelegosto crossing the bridge next to them. So he tells his cage to stop, but Moses' cage, they stop momentarily. But since they see that Will's cage isn't moving, they take the opportunity to try to climb up even more. So they're trying to go a little slowly, but Will and everyone is like, stop, and they're all laughing, making their way up. But Moses then grabs onto a snake, and then he sees it and he starts yelling and scares everyone. And when one person loses their grip, then the other person loses their grip, and then they don't have enough weight to hold the cage up, and everyone breaks off, and the cage is sent back down into the ravine. And because of the force of the fall, the rope snaps, and down goes the cage with Moses and the rest of the crew, and they are done for. So, of course, now that Pelegosto has seen that cage and sees Will's cage moving up the cliff, so they are in trouble. So another Pelegosto comes back to Jack and the center here with a torch, and he's like, oh, fire. So he then lights the fire under Jack Sparrow here, and it's time for the feast to begin. So he's about to light it, but the Pelegosto boy who saw the bone cages going up the cliff, he tells everyone they're trying to escape. So they all look back at Jack, and then Jack's like, "We'll go on, go get them." And then Jack's like, "We'll go on, go get them." And they all leave, and they drop the torch right next to Jack, and the wind then sends a couple of sparks into the wood under Jack and starts lighting the fire. So Jack starts blowing on it, and it starts to light even more. And then we go back over to the bone cage, which has finally reached the top of the cliff. And once they reach it, Will's like, cut it loose, find a rock. And then we go back over to Jack, who was trying to bounce himself off the fire. And he succeeds in this, and he rolls off, and he breaks his legs free, and he starts to run away again. And then as soon as Will and the rest of the crew break the bone cage loose, they see all the Pelegostos running after them, and they start to roll the cage. So, of course, they are pretty much just a hamster in a hamster ball, and they reach a cliff, and they start just tumbling down this cliff super, super fast. And they just fly off, and then we get these great reactions of the camera on Will, Marty, and Gibbs just screaming as they're flying down the cliff. And I love how they roll all the way up this tree and then just smack down to the ground. And of course, the Pelegostos are still chasing after them. So Will's like, lift the cage. And then Gibbs is like, come on, lads, lift it like a lady's skirt. And I love how they all lift it, and Marty is too small, so he kind of just like, he's just waddling his legs back and forth. But we can then go back over to Jack, who is going to try to do his jump here. So he's trying to get out, but then he sees another Pelegosto boy with a knife and a fork. And then Jack goes over and grabs the knife from this boy, and the boy then runs away. So Jack tries to cut himself loose, and then he sees 2 more Pelegosto women in front of him, and he just screams and runs at them, and then smashes into a coconut. And then he gets the idea to then use that big bamboo stick to throw that coconut, and the Pelegosto woman catches it right in front of her face, and then now we have a food fight going on. So then we go back to Will and the crew in the bone cage, and they are running with the cage here. The Pelegosto is chasing them down, and then they fall right down into a big ravine. And as they fall, the bone cage breaks open. And this is the location I was referring to earlier. This is also on the island of Dominica. But this is a ravine that Gore found on the research trip, as I've said before, that is kind of off the beaten path. And I think it's a gorgeous place, but when they went to shoot in it, they shot in it for 2 days. And they had, of course, everyone in the shot here. But the water was freezing. And they would shoot for 6 or 7 hours a day in this little cavern here. And they would have to swim everyone in, of course, because it's all in water and it's a very tight thing. So they had to swim all the equipment in, they had to swim the crew in, and to swim the cast in. There's a great little behind-the-scenes clip of Kevin McNally, who plays Gibbs, on a little raft as he's getting waded in, and he's like, "Funny way to get to the office." But I love that. And then there's also a little interview moment with David Bailey, who plays Cotton, who he was saying at the end of the first day, after 6 hours, the only 2 people left were him and Kevin McNally. Everyone else had gone off the shot because it was so cold in the water. But they filmed down here for, I think, it was 2 days in this beautiful ravine on Dominica. But it was super freezing cold water. But when Gore saw the location, he's like, we have to shoot here for this scene. So there's no stopping Gore when he sees something he likes. So the crew here has now broken out of the bone cage, and they're swimming through this ravine. And then we have it keeps cutting back and forth between the food fight with Jack and the Pelegostos, and then the Pelegostos trying to shoot the crew in the water. And they all take refuge behind this rock wall. And then we go back over to Jack, and he tells everyone to stop it, because we have this great shot of 10 pieces of fruit stuck on either end of Jack's bamboo stick here. So he's just covered in fruit debris and everything. And so the crew, we then go back over to them, and they are behind a rock wall in cover. And as the Pelegostos see them one more time, the Pelegosto boy that Jack took the knife from tells them that he has escaped, and they go back over to Jack. So then the crew are now free to go, and Jack takes this opportunity to then pole vault himself over to the other side of the cliff, and he does make it. I'm surprised he did, but because of all the fruit stuck on his pole, it starts to weigh him down, and then he just falls right off the cliff and goes flying down the big chasm here, and the stick gets stuck between the 2 cliffs because it's so narrow, and then he just the rope all comes off, and then he is stuck hanging by his foot. So the Pelegosto women, they see him just hanging there, and they just leave. And then Jack is kind of stuck in a terrible spot here, and then he just says, "Bugger." And then the stick breaks loose, and he begins to fall down one more time. And then he falls through a ton of bridges. He falls through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bridges. It's actually 6 bridges before he finally hits the ground, and the pole slams right next to him, barely misses him, and then all the fruit falls down right beside him. So I am shocked that Jack survived that fall. I'm guessing hitting the bridges took a lot of the force out, but still, that was a long drop. But I guess you can do anything if you're Captain Jack Sparrow. So the crew then makes it back to the Black Pearl, and then Pintel and Rigetti, of course, are trying to get the ship free, and they've done a lot of the work for them. And I love Pintel here. He's like, "Haul loose the mooring line." And then Rigetti is trying to get his eye back from Jack the Monkey, because Jack the Monkey, of course, is still in the ship, and he has stolen Rigetti's eye. And he's like, "Little hairy thief, give it back." And then he hears Pintel say, "Pull loose the mooring line." And then Rigetti's like, "He's got my eye, he won't give it back." And Pintel's like, "Well, how'd you get it back last time?" And then the crew comes up and Gibbs is like, "Excellent, our work's half done." And then Pintel's like, "We done it for you, knowing you'd be coming back." And then Gibbs is like, "Make ready to sail, boys." And then Will's like, "What about Jack? I won't leave without him." And then we just hear Jack in the distance. It's like, "Oi!" And they all turn around and they see Jack appear out of nowhere. And they all start smiling. And then they see all the Pelagostos chasing him. And then we have this great, fantastic line delivery from Orlando Bloom where he's like, "Time to go." And then Gibbs is like, "Cast off those lines." And they all try to make their way on the ship as fast as possible. But then we, of course, have this iconic scene of Jack running away from the Pelagostos, which is now iconic. It's one of the best scenes in movie history. I mean, maybe not one of the best, but one of the most iconic, definitely in recent years. But he passes by the prison dog, and he's like, "Good doggy." And then he turns back, he's like, "Ah!" And he just keeps running as the Pelagostos chase him down. He finally makes it back to the Black Pearl, and then he's like, "Alas, my children, this is the day you shall always remember as the day you almost caught." And then a giant wave hits Jack, interrupting his line, and then he just continues, and he's like, "Captain Jack Sparrow," and then he starts climbing on the ship. And now I'll say here, that big wave was not scripted. That was actually a random wave that came out of nowhere while Johnny was delivering his line. So he was just going to do the line, "You almost caught Captain Jack Sparrow," but that wave hit him, and he just had the great idea to just keep going with the interruption. So I love that moment with Johnny there. But, of course, as the Black Pearl pulls away, the prison dog is still on this island with the Pelagostos here, and he begins to just run away, and the Pelagostos start chasing the dog down. Yeah, but I mean, don't worry about the dog. The dog is not harmed. No animals were harmed in the making of this film. If you're scared about the dog, just go to the end credit scene of this film. Also spoilers, but it's a 16-year-old movie. Anyway, we're finally off the island of the Pelagostos, and we're back aboard the Black Pearl from that little side quest. So I know a lot of people kind of criticize that part of the movie because it's not really important at all with the cannibals and the Pelagostos, because it doesn't really drive the plot further. But I think it's a fun little side quest in the movie before we really get into the meat of the greater story of this film. But of course, Jack is on the Pearl, and Gibbs is like, "Let's put some distance between us and this island and head to open sea." And then I love how Jack is like, "Yes to the first, yes to the second, but only if we stay, so keep the shallows as much as possible." And then I love how he turns around and he sees Pintel and Rigetti, and they just salute him, and he's like super confused, like, why are they here? And then Gibbs is like, "That seems a bit contradictory, sir." And then Jack is like, "Mr. Gibbs, I have faith in your reconciliatory navigational skills. Now where is that monkey? I want to shoot something." So then Jack the Monkey drops Rigetti's eye finally, and Pintel gives Jack a pistol, and he's getting ready to shoot Jack the Monkey. But then Will comes up, and he's like, "Jack, Elizabeth is in danger." And then Jack's like, "Have you considered just locking her up somewhere?" And then Will's like, "She is locked up, bound to hang for helping you." And then Jack's like, "There comes a time where one must take responsibility for one's mistakes." And then Will is fed up. He grabs his sword off one of the crewmen, and he puts it to Jack's neck, and he's like, "I need that compass of yours, Jack. I must trade it for her freedom." And then Jack pulls the blade away, kind of a bit of a parallel to the first movie where Will pulls a sword on Jack. But Jack is like, "Mr. Gibbs, we have a need to travel upriver." And then when Jack says this, Gibbs is kind of scared. He's like, "By need, do you mean a trifling need? Fleeting, as in, say, a passing fancy?" And then Jack's like, no, a resolute and unyielding need. And then Will comes back up and he's like, what we need to do is make sail for Port Royal with all haste. And then Jack's like, William, I shall trade you the compass if you help me find this. And then he pulls out the drawing of the key. And then Will looks at it and he's like, you want me to find this? And then I love this moment here that's coming up with Jack. He's like, no, you want you to find this. Because the finding of this finds you incapacitorily finding or locating and you're discovering a way to save your Dolly Bell hole what's-a-face. Savvy? Oh my god. And then Will grabs it from Jack and he's like, this is going to save Elizabeth. And then Jack's like, how much do you know about Davy Jones? And then Will's like, not much. And then Jack's like, yeah, it's going to save Elizabeth. Oh, I love that. And then we go back over to Port Royal, where we're introduced to the Edinburgh Trader, which is a very cool merchant ship here that appears plenty of times through this movie. But this ship here is the one that, well, we don't know yet, but the sailors on this ship, they're just mopping up, and one of them finds Elizabeth's wedding dress on board, hidden behind some cargo. And then all the crewmen are arguing over this dress, and then the captain of the ship, who is Bellamy, Captain Bellamy is his name, he comes up and he says, what's all this? And he sees all the men arguing over the dress, and he's like, if you both fancy the dress, you'll just share and wear it one after the other. And they all start laughing, and then some of the crewmen are like, it's not like that, sir. This ship is haunted. And then Bellamy's like, is it now? And then he asks the other crewmen, he's like, there's a female presence among us here. The crew, they can feel it. And then I love how in the background of the shot you can see Elizabeth just chilling out. And then one of the other crewmen comes up and he says, it's a ghost of a lady wedded before her marriage, I figure it. Searching for her husband, lost at sea. A virgin, too, likely as not. Which, kind of odd, but one of the crewmen, he's like, I say we throw the dress overboard and hope the spirit follows it. And then he proposes this idea to Bellamy, and then the other crewman's like, no, that'll just anger the spirit, sir. And then he's like, what we need to do is find out what the spirit needs and then get it back to her. And they keep arguing again. And then Bellamy's like, enough! You're a pair of superstitious goats and it's got the best of you. And then he's like, now this appears to be no more as we have a stowaway on board. A young woman by the look of it. And then he says, I want you to search the ship and find her. And then he's like, oh, and she's probably naked. And then with that comment, they're all rushing to find her. Which, a little awkward, but Elizabeth just goes along with it and tries to make herself blend in. And then we go right back over to another island here where the Black Pearl is anchored out in the water, and we have two rowboats going down the river, or going up the river, into the bayou to go see our next major character in this film. So we're now going upriver into the bayou. And Will is asking Gibbs, why is Jack afraid of the open ocean? And Gibbs is like, well, if you believe such things, there's a beast that does the bidding of Davy Jones. And then we have this great pause, and Gibbs explains himself. He's like, a fearsome creature with giant tentacles that'll suction your face clean off. And then I love Pintel and Righetti's reactions here too. And then Gibbs is like, and drag an entire ship down to the crushing darkness. And then we have the big reveal here, and Gibbs finally says, the Kraken. And of course, the Kraken is, of course, a real mythological creature that a lot of people believe is somewhere lurking in the ocean of our world. And when they were kind of crafting the villains of this film and Davy Jones, they were thinking about the Kraken, like, oh yeah, the Kraken would be a great kind of addition to Davy Jones and his kind of arsenal. So they adapted the myth of the Kraken and then added it into this film as well. So of course this kind of scares all the crew, and Gibbs continues, and he's like, they say the stench of its breath is like, ugh, and he shudders, and he's like, imagine, the last thing you know on God's green earth is the roar of the Kraken and the reeking odor of 1,000 rotting corpses. And then Gibbs is like, if you believe such things. And then Will's like, and the key will spare him that? And then Gibbs is like, well, that's the very question Jack once answered. Bad enough even to go visit her. And then Will is confused when he's like, her. And then Gibbs is like, I. So, of course, even Gibbs is kind of worried about who they're going to see. Will has no clue. But they finally make it up river to a shack, or there's a bunch of shacks in this river, but the important shack in this river, they finally make it over to it, and they dock the boats, and Jack gets out, and he says a great line here. I love this line. He's like, no worries, mates. Tiadama and I go way back. Thick as thieves, nigh inseparable we are. Once were, have been, before. I love that. And Gibbs is like, and watch your back. And then Jack's like, it's me front I'm worried about. And then I love how Gibbs and the rest of the crew go down the line. They kind of play telephone here. So Gibbs is like, mind the boat. And then Will's like, mind the boat. And then Will tells Rigetti, mind the boat. And he tells Pintel, mind the boat. And then Pintel tells Marty, mind the boat. And then Marty tells Cotton to mind the boat. And then Cotton's parrot then tells Cotton to mind the boat, and the parrot flies away. And then Cotton's just left in the boat by himself. Oh, I love that part. So then we have this great shot of Jack peeking through the door, and he's just like crouching his way through. And then we have the reveal of Tiadama, played by Naomi Harris. I love Naomi Harris's performance as Tiadama in Pirates 2 and 3. She is fantastic. I haven't seen a lot of her movies. This is really the role I know her for. But she's just a fantastic actress, and she just makes this character so fantastic and so eerie and scary, but also so witty and charming. So I love Tiadama. But Tiadama sees Jack, and she's like, Jack Sparrow. So they get introduced once again, and Jack's kind of avoiding all the weird things, just hanging around her shack here. And then Tiadama goes up and she says, I always knew the wind was going to blow your back to me one day. And then she gets distracted from Jack, and we have this fantastic moment, I love this, and I'll say it right now, where she sees Will behind Jack, and then she points to him and she says, you. And then she goes up to him and she says, you have a touch of destiny about you, William Turner. And then Will is really confused here, and he's like, you know me? But the reason I point this out is this is a very great moment of foreshadowing about Will's character. It's the first mention from Tiadama to Will about him having a touch of destiny, and we don't know what that means in this movie, and we won't know what that means until the end of the next movie. But I love that moment. It's a great foreshadowing moment. If you know what happens to Will, this is a fantastic moment here. And of course, Will's like, you know me? And then Tiadama's like, you want to know me? And then Jack jumps between them. He's like, there'll be no knowing here. We've come for help, and we're not leaving without it. Then he pulls Tiadama away. He's like, I thought I knew you. And she's like, not so well as I had hoped. And then Tiadama says, come. And then Jack's like, come. And then he just points down to the chair. I love Jack Sparrow in this scene is fantastic. Oh my God. But they all get settled, and Tiadama kind of presses herself onto Will here, and she's like, what service may I do you? And she then says, you know I demand payment. And then Jack's like, I brought payment. And then out of nowhere comes Jack the Monkey in a cage. And then Jack shoots Jack the monkey, and he doesn't die. And he's like, see? An undead monkey. Top that. And he gives it to her for payment. And then she immediately opens the cage and lets Jack the monkey free. And they're all like, oh, you have no idea how long it took us to catch that. And then Tiadama's like, the payment is fair. So then Will brings out the drawing of the key, and he says, we're looking for this and what it leads to. And then Tiadama sees it, and she immediately knows what it is. And she tries to mask her emotions here. And then she says something very interesting here. She says, the compass you bartered from me, it cannot lead you to this. So that's also the reveal of Jack got his compass from Tiadama. But in this, a more interesting thing is we have this shot of Jack with a hat in his hands. And if you look at that hat looks strangely familiar. It's actually Barbossa's hat. And of course, I won't spoil it because we haven't really gotten to the plot yet, to the end of the movie. But Jack is holding Barbossa's hat here, which is our first hint of someone coming back. So, of course, Jack is he doesn't want to say that his compass isn't working, but Tiadama knows, and the reason that it's not working, Tiadama says, Jack Sparrow does not know what he wants. So that's why it keeps endlessly spinning, because he wants the key, but he also is very confused, so he doesn't know. It's not pointing to anything because he doesn't know really what he wants. So Tiadama then explains, your key go to a chest, and it lay inside the chest you seek, don't it? And then I love Pintel, Rigetti, and Gibbs are kind of like the peanut gallery in this scene. Like, what is inside? And then Pintel's like, gold, jewels, unclaimed properties of a valuable nature. And then Rigetti's looking at a case of eyes, and he's like, nothing bad, I hope. And then Tiadama then says, you know of Davy Jones, a man of the sea, a great sailor, until he run afoul of that which vexes all men. And then Will asks, what vexes all men? And then Tiadama starts laughing, and she's like, what indeed? And then Gibbs is like, well, the sea. And then Pintel's like, sums. And then Rigetti's like, the dichotomy of good and evil. And then Gibbs and Pintel look at him all confused. And then Jack finally states the obvious, and he's like, a woman. And then Tiadama continues, and she says, a woman. He fell in love. And then Gibbs is like, no, I heard it was the sea he fell in love with. Pay attention to that line. And then Tiadama then says, same story, different versions, and all are true. So, Jack says it was a woman, but then Gibbs says, I thought it was the sea he fell in love with. But it's actually both of those, because he fell in love with, drumroll, Calypso. He fell in love with the sea goddess Calypso. I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but since we're getting into the story of Davy Jones here, I might as well just say it. But he fell in love with the sea goddess Calypso, who was a woman, but was also the sea, because she was the goddess of the sea. So it was both, actually. But Tiadama keeps going, and she says, see, it was a woman, as changing and harsh and untamable as the sea. Him never stopped loving her, but the pain it caused him was too much to live with, but not enough to cause him to die. And then Will is very nervous about what Tiadama's going to say next, and he says, what exactly did he put into the chest? And then Tiadama then says, him heart. And then everyone's kind of creeped out, and then Rigetti's like, literally or figuratively? And then Pintel's like, he couldn't literally put his heart in a chest. And then he looks at Tiadama, he's like, Could he? And then Tiadama says, it was not worth feeling what small, fleeting joy life brings. So, he carved out him heart, and hide the chest from the world. The key he keep with him at all times. And as soon as Will hears that, he stands up and he goes over to Jack, and he's like, you knew this. And then Jack's like, I did not. I didn't know where the key was, but now we do. So all that's left is to climb aboard the Flying Dutchman, grab the key. You go back to Port Royal and save a Bonnie Lass. Hey! And then he begins to walk away, and Tiadama says, let me see your hand. And Jack's kind of nervous here, and he goes over and lets Tiadama pull the bandage off of his palm. And everyone's kind of curious about what is on his hand, so Pintel, Rigetti, and Gibbs are looking at it. Then she pulls it off, and then Gibbs is like, oh, the black spot! And then he starts doing this fantastic little, like, ritual here where he pats his chest and then spins around and spits. And then I love how after he does that, Rigetti and Pintel are like, the black spot! And they do it too. I love that. I love that little moment there. There's that little superstitious jig they do. And then I love it after they do that, Jack's like, my eyesight's as good as ever, just so you know. And then Tiadama goes off to go look for something. She goes into the next room, and we can see Jack the monkey in that room as well. And everyone looks over, and while she's doing that, Jack looks down and he sees a few things on this table. One is Tiadama's locket here, which, keep that in mind, that'll come up pretty soon. But he also sees a ring, a purple and gold ring, which also belonged to Barbossa. If you remember in the first film, that was one of his rings. So Jack grabs that ring and keeps that for his own. But Pintel, Rigetti, and Gibbs, they look over into that room and they see Jack the monkey standing next to a pair of boots on a bed, which is our next hint that Barbossa is here in this shack. But Tiadama comes back and she says, Davy Jones cannot make port, can only step on land but once every 10 years. And then she says, land is where you're safe, Jack Sparrow, so you will carry land with you. And then she offers him a jar of dirt, and he grabs it from her, and Jack is confused, and he's like, dirt. This is a jar of dirt. And then Tiadama's like, yes. And then Jack's like, is the jar of dirt going to help? And then Tiadama's like, if you don't want it, give it back. And then I love how Jack's all protective, and he's like, no. And he like pulls it away. And then she's like, then it helps. And then Will says, it seems we have a need to find the Flying Dutchman. So Tiadama sits down again, and she grabs some shells and stuff, and crab pincers, and then she has them in her hands, and she says, a touch of destiny, and then she puts them out on the table, and then we have this great shot where all those shells and pincers, they turn into rocks in the ocean, and then we are thrust over into a rainy, stormy night where we have a ship that is currently beached on a reef that's split in two, and it's, well, the ship's not looking too good. So everyone's looking at it, and Will is like, that's the Flying Dutchman. And then I love how Jack's like, and he's like all like awkward, and then Will's like, she doesn't look like much. And then Jack comes up, he's like, neither do you. Do not underestimate her. He elbows Gibbs, and then Gibbs is like, must have run afoul of the reef. And then Jack's like, so what's your plan then? And then Will's like, I row over, search the ship until I find your bloody key. And then Jack's like, and if they're a crewman? And then Will says, I cut down anyone in my path. And then Jack's like, I like it. Simple, easy to remember. So then Will goes down, because they're of course sending Will over to go inspect this ship, which Will is under the impression is the Flying Dutchman. So Will is about to get into the boat, but Jack stops him, and he's like, if you happen to get captured, just say Jack Sparrow sent you to settle his debt. Might save your life. And then Ragetti pushes the boat off, and he's like, bon voyage. And then Jack gives the order to douse the lamps. So the crew douses every lamp on the ship, and we have this great shot after they blow them out of all the lamps going out one by one as Will rows over. And Will finally makes his way over to this shipwreck here, and he gets on, and, well, obviously this isn't the Flying Dutchman, and Will knows it's not the Flying Dutchman. But Will is looking, and then he sees, he goes past one crewman who is kind of just in a bunch of wreckage, who is dead, of course. And then he goes over to another one who's still alive and is pulling on a rope. And the sailor is saying, hoisting the jib, captain's orders. And then Will's like, sailor. And, this sailor is completely obsessed with, trying to hoist the jib of the ship here, but Will's like, no, there's no use, you've run aground. And then the sailor's like, no, beneath us, foul breath. And then Will he's like, oh boy. And then he's distracted by a sailor falling into the water, and this guy is still alive, so Will goes over to help him. And then as soon as Will goes over, he grabs this guy and flips him over, and then he sees this guy has had his face suctioned off. So of course everything Gibbs was saying, the foul breath and could suction your face clean off, actually did occur. And it's scary when he flips that guy over and he just has no face left. It's pretty freaky. But right after Will sees that, the Flying Dutchman shoots out of the ocean next to it, and we finally have the reveal of the Flying Dutchman. Such a fantastic ship. I love the entrance. It's so fantastic. And I love how you have the water pouring out of the portholes on the ship, because, of course, it came out from under the waves. But the Flying Dutchman's coming up next to this shipwreck, and then we have the whole Dutchman crew pops out onto the shipwreck with Will on it. And we have all of our crew members here. We have Prolifico, Kalenico, we have Clanker, we have Greenbeard, we have all of them. They all have names, and I'll try to do my best to say which one is which when we see them in the scenes. But these guys just look so awesome. And then Clanker, who is the guy with the chain shots as his weapon, he comes up and is ready to fight Will, and Clanker says, down on your marrow bones and pray. And then he starts fighting Will, and him and Will fight, and then Will is trying to take down as many of these guys as possible. So he tries to stab them and cut them and everything, but they just don't die. And then he douses his sword in that barrel of oil and smashes the lamp, which lights his sword on fire. And there's actually a great little bonus feature for Dead Man's Chest as well, which is mastering the sword. There's a whole bunch of them for different characters in the movie, but the one for Orlando Bloom, there's actually a little segment where they rehearse this. So what they did was that sword, of course, it doesn't light on fire with just the oil. It doesn't actually work like that. So what they did, they made a special sword with a oil line rigged into the actual sword, and they had that line going all the way up Orlando's arm, so it was covered by his wardrobe and everything, but it went all the way up his arm and out, so they could light it, so the crew could light it and everything. And of course this is very dangerous, but Orlando of course had to do this because Orlando is shown on screen doing this, so they couldn't just use a stuntman for this. So of course they rehearsed the actual moves he was going to do, and then they did a test where they lit the sword, and Orlando kind of swung it around a bit. But of course, it was a very dangerous thing. They had to make sure everything was, set and everything would work perfectly, so that this would actually work. But so what they did when they lit it on fire, and then Orlando kind of switched it around for the shots, and then they immediately doused it after that. So it was kind of just for the swings that he did, just to get those done, and they kind of doused it after that. But back to the movie here, Will is kind of fending the Dutchman crew off with his flaming sword, and then one of the crewmen comes up, and Will just slices him open, and a bunch of fish and guts just come flying out of him. Pretty gross. But that guy kind of stumbles back. Will thinks he killed him, but he's not actually dead, because these guys can't die either. And then another crew member just knocks Will out cold, and Will just falls on the deck, and the crew comes up and grabs him. And then we are thrust over to Will and the rest of the crew of that ship, who are facing judgment on for their lives here. And then we finally have the reveal of our main villain in this film an hour in. We also get the first glimpse of Macus, the first mate of the Flying Dutchman here. And he tells Davy Jones, 5 men still alive. The rest have moved on. And then we just see the back of Davy Jones here, and we don't see his face until he makes his way over to one of these crewmen. And then we just see this great shot of him and his crab claw. And then we finally see his face as he bends down to this crewman, and he lights his pipe. And oh my god, the CGI on Davy Jones, CGI on the Kraken, the CGI in these films is so good. So good. The CGI is fantastic. And it's crazy how the CGI is. Honestly, it looks better than stuff that comes out today. But of course, this is Bill Nighy, who is playing Davy Jones. And of course, even though this guy is completely generated by CG, Bill Nighy was, of course, actually on set, as so was the rest of the Dutchman crew. So they all wore the mocap suit. So it was just the gray suit with the white balls all over it, and then they also had the white paint dots on their face to capture their facial movements, so they could keep those visible in the actual CG characters once they animated them. But I think one of the main reasons that Davy Jones works so well is because of Bill Nighy's performance. And I'm so happy they were able to really capture and keep a lot of his facial movements. Because if you look back at some of behind the scenes and you see Bill Nighy acting out, he looks like, he doesn't look like Davy Jones, but he, of course, does the voice and everything. But his face is so similar to Davy Jones because they really took Bill Nighy's really expressive face and they put it onto this character. Because, of course, Bill Nighy had to be more expressive so they could really get those big facial movements because of Davy Jones, because his face is a squid. They really had to get those really animated expressions to really kind of bring them across on screen here. But when you see Bill Nighy in the mocap suit on set, you think nothing of it. You just think, oh, that's Davy Jones. Because it's not just the scary squid-faced monster guy we see on screen here that's Davy Jones. The big part of Davy Jones is Bill Nighy and his performance. So I'm such a big fan of Bill Nighy here, and Davy Jones, such a fantastic villain, probably the best CG animated villain of all time. But of course he lights his pipe here, and he then says one of his iconic lines where he says, "Do you fear death? Do you fear that dark abyss? All your deeds laid bare, all your sins punished. I can offer you an escape. And then one of the crew members says, don't listen to him. And then we see this guy is holding a rosary here. And Davy Jones is super angry, goes over this guy and chokes him with his crab claw. And then Davy Jones just simply says, do you not fear death? And then he puts his pipe in his mouth. And then this guy says, I'll take my chances, sir. And then Davy Jones releases him. And he tells Greenbeard here, who is the guy behind the sailor, to the depths. And then Greenbeard goes and slices this guy's neck and throws him overboard. And as soon as he does that, one of the other sailors says, cruel blackguard. And then Davy Jones says, life is cruel. Why should the afterlife be any different? I offer you a choice. Join my crew and postpone that judgment. 100 years before the mast, will ye serve? And then this one crew member, he says, I will serve. And then Jones is all happy here, and he goes over to the next crew member, and that's Will Turner. So he looks at Will, and he's super confused. He's like, you are neither dead nor dying. What is your purpose here? And then Will's like, Jack Sparrow sent me to settle his debt. And then Davy Jones is like, what is your purpose here? And then Will's like, Jack Sparrow sent me to settle his debt. And then Davy Jones is like, did he now? I'm sorely tempted to accept that offer. And then we have this great shot of Jack looking through his spyglass of Davy Jones, and Davy Jones turns around in the spyglass, and Jack lowers it, and Davy Jones is on the Black Pearl. I love that shot. And then the Dutchman crew materializes on the Black Pearl as well, and yeah, not good. And they get everyone captured, and then Jack just says, oh. And then Davy Jones says, you have a debt to pay. We've been captain of the Black Pearl for 13 years. That was our agreement. And then Jack says, well, technically I was only captain for 2 years, and I was viciously mutinied upon. Then Jack says, then you were a poor captain, but a captain nonetheless. Have you not introduced yourself all these years as Captain Jack Sparrow? And then the crew starts laughing. And then Jack's like, you have my payment. 1 soul to serve on your ship is already over there. 1 soul was not equal to another, Davy Jones then says. And then Jack says, we've established my proposal in sound and principle, and now we're just haggling over price. And then Davy Jones is like, price? And then he just like, I love that pop in his lips after he says price. It's so great. Oh my god. And then Jack goes up and he says, just how many souls do you think my soul is worth? And then Jones contemplates this for a second and he says, 100 souls, 3 days. And then Jack says, you're a diamond, mate. Just send me back the boy and I'll get started right off. And then he gets stopped by Macus, who growls at him. And then Davy Jones then says, I keep the boy. A good faith payment. That leaves you only 99 more to go. Ha 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 ha. And he starts laughing, of course. I love Davy Jones's laugh. I love everything about Davy Jones. But then Jack then tells Davy Jones about Will. And it's like, have you not met Will Turner? He's noble, heroic, a terrific soprano, worth at least 4, maybe 3.5. But I happen to mention, he's in love with a girl, due to be married, betrothed. Dividing him from her and her from him would only be half as bad as letting them be joined in holy matrimony. Eh? And of course, this is Jack trying to get under Jones's skin, because this is a sore topic for Davy Jones. Because, of course, I'll continue with the story of Davy Jones here. You know, after he came back for Calypso after 10 years at sea doing his duty that she gave to him, she was not there. And that broke Davy Jones's heart. And that made him cut out his heart, put it in a chest, and that, of course, after not doing his duty, that turned him into the monster that he is now, and the rest of his crew, of course. So that's kind of why he looks like this, why the crew looks like that, why they're all sea creatures, because since they haven't done their duty of ferrying souls to the next world, they have become monsters, pretty much. Claimed by the sea. So that's why they're all kind of different sea creatures. There's a lot of different cool Flying Dutchman crew member sketches as well of different crew members we don't see in the films. Like there was a turtle guy. There was there's a ton of cool ones you can find online. A bunch of different paintings and portraits of different Flying Dutchman crew members. But I just love all their designs. They're all so interesting and different. But of course, Jack's trying to get under Davy Jones's skin because he knows this is a sore topic for him. But Jones shakes it off and he turns back to Jack and he says, "I keep the boy 99 souls." And then he said, "But I wonder, Sparrow, can you live with this? Can you condemn an innocent man, a friend, to a lifetime of servitude in your name while you roam free?" And then we have a great pause, and then Jack's like, "Yep, I'm good with it. Shall we seal it in blood? I mean, ink?" And then Davy Jones's tentacle hand grabs Jack's hand with the black spot, and then he says 3 days, and then he tries to yank his hand off and it's stuck, and he just finally pulls it off and he leaves, and the crew leaves, of course. So Jack and the crew are finally safe from Jones, and Jack looks and he sees the black spot has disappeared, because he now has 3 days left to pay his debt. So he then says, "Mr. Gibbs," and then he says, "I feel sullied and unusual." And then Gibbs is like, "How do you intend to harvest these 99 souls in 3 days?" And then Jack's like, "Fortunately, he was mum as to the condition in which these souls need be." And then Gibbs is like, "Ah, Tortuga." And then Jack wipes his hand on Gibbs's clothes and he's like, "Tortuga." And we'll end right there. I think that's a great stopping point. This is already a super long episode, even longer than last week's. Oh man. But I just got carried away. I wanted to introduce Davy Jones in this episode. I was going to kind of stop right after we finished with Tiadama. But I was like, no, I feel like we should introduce Davy Jones in this episode because I know that's what people are waiting for. So give it to them now so they don't have to wait another week for Davy Jones. So currently right now, I'll give you an update. We are We are an hour and 6 minutes into Dead Man's Chest, which gives us an hour and 27 minutes left. Or I guess about an hour and 20 minutes left, not including the credits. So probably going to be 4 episodes, maybe 5 episodes for the entire film. And these are some longer episodes. Of course, because I'm using the actual film in the background. I'm not using just notes. As I said in the last episode, for Curse of the Black Pearl, I just had some rough notes, and those episodes ended up, pretty short, 45 minutes, 50-minute episodes. But I feel like I really left a lot of stuff out, and I don't want to leave stuff out. I want to kind of really talk about every detail of these films and this franchise, because that's the whole point of this podcast, is to educate people about the little nuances and the little things in Pirates of the Caribbean. So that'll do it for this episode. Next week we'll continue right where we left off. We're going right back to the Edinburgh Trader, because Elizabeth is drafting a plan to get herself to Tortuga as well. But we'll see that next time. If you enjoyed this podcast and this episode so far, I'm happy you made it to this point. It's been, before editing, it's been 87 minutes, which is very long. I'm sorry for how long this episode is, but if you've enjoyed, please give us a rating on Spotify, or if you're on Apple Podcasts, give us a review as well. So far, it seems that everyone is listening on Spotify, but if you are on Apple Podcasts, I'm not forgetting about you. Go and leave a review to show me you actually exist out there. But I thank you for listening. Next week we'll continue with Dead Man's Chest, so I'll see you then. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or a question, send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Twitter at podcast, POTC, and you can follow us on Instagram as well, at Podcast of the Caribbean. I'll be posting some content, some other fun stuff over there, so make sure you go give them a follow. And always remember, keep a weather eye on the horizon, and dead men tell no tales.